Right. Let's dive deep today, folks, into power dynamics, strategy, and, well, maybe even a little bit of deception.
Yeah, sounds a bit intense.
Yeah, well, you sent me these excerpts from the 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene
Oh, yeah.
and some historical examples, literary connections.
Uh-huh.
We're going to unpack all of that. And I'm really interested to see what we can glean from all of this.
You know, what I think is really fascinating about Greene's work is that he really kind of delves into that darker side of human nature, like ambition and
Right.
the pursuit of power. But I think he does it in a way that's not necessarily endorsing manipulation,
Yeah.
but rather providing a lens
Oh, I like that.
through which we can understand those kind of hidden forces at play in human interaction.
Lens for understanding. I like that a lot. So speaking of lenses, let's use this lens to look at the first law he throws down,
Right.
which is to never outshine the master.
Mm.
This seems on its face a little bit counterintuitive, right? We're always taught to strive to be the best.
To stand out.
To stand out, exactly. But he seems to be saying something very, very different here.
Well, yeah, he's really highlighting the importance of navigating those power dynamics that exist in any kind of hierarchy.
Yeah.
You know? And sometimes it can be more advantageous to make your superiors feel comfortably superior than it is to, try to be the brightest star in the room.
Yeah.
Because that can actually backfire.
And he uses a pretty drastic example historically to kind of drive this point home.
Yeah.
Something to do with King Louis XIV, right?
Yeah. King Louis XIV. This is a great story. So Nicolas Fouquet, who was Louis XIV's finance minister, threw this extravagant party,
Right.
thinking it would demonstrate, loyalty and maybe even earn him a promotion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it backfired.
It backfired spectacularly, right?
Yeah. The party was so opulent, like so over the top, that it completely overshadowed the king.
So kind of like showing up to a potluck with a 5-tiered wedding cake and everyone else brought like chips and dip.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And, Louis XIV was not known for his sense of humor.
Right.
Fouquet ended up imprisoned, and Louis basically appropriated many of his ideas, his possessions, even the concept for the Palace of Versailles.
Oh, wow.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
Ouch. So, even with good intentions, obviously, misreading the power dynamic can have pretty severe consequences.
Absolutely.
And he seems to be saying that sometimes restraint is more powerful than, really going for it.
Strategic restraint.
Strategic restraint, yeah. And there are other examples, right, of powerful figures eliminating threats.
Oh, absolutely. Cesare Borgia,
Yeah.
who was a major player in Renaissance Italy, felt so threatened by Astor Manfredi that he had him eliminated, just to eliminate any potential competition.
It's a good reminder that even those with good intentions can be seen as threats to those in power.
Exactly.
Right. So not only do we have to be mindful of our own ambitions, but also those of those above us and how they might perceive our actions.
Absolutely.
But Greene doesn't just talk about how to appease those in power. He also offers a law, Law 9, which is use enemies to your advantage, which is a bit more, I don't know, shall we say, proactive.
Mm-hmm.
How is having enemies advantageous?
Well, he makes this argument that a little bit of healthy competition can actually be good for you. It can keep you sharp. It can enhance your reputation. If you have a rival, you're less likely to become complacent.
Right, you have to up your game.
Exactly. You have to constantly be improving, innovating to kind of stay ahead of the game.
And he uses, I think, the example of Mao Zedong for this, which I thought was an interesting choice.
Yeah, it's a little surprising, but I think it's a brilliant example. So during World War II, Mao really skillfully used the conflict with the Japanese as a way to actually build up his own power.
Wow.
He used it to train his troops to position himself as the leader most capable of resisting the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
So he was actually using that conflict to strengthen his own standing.
So almost like playing, I don't know, three-dimensional chess, right?
Yeah.
Using that conflict to bolster his own power. And that makes you think, right, how many historical events have been shaped by leaders kind of doing the same thing, right? Using conflict to their own advantage. It's a very interesting concept.
Absolutely. And, speaking of shaping perceptions, Greene also delves into the art of deception, or what he calls deception, right?
Right.
And Law 12, use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim, is a really good example of this.
Okay, disarm your victim. sounds a bit intense, but tell me more about this.
Okay. So it's about this idea that acts of kindness, even ones that appear totally genuine,
Right.
can be really powerful tools of persuasion or even manipulation.
So I'm thinking, is this kind of like the Trojan horse, right?
Exactly.
Where you offer a gift, but really it's a way to kind of get in there and take over. He uses the example of Al Capone.
Yes, he does. Al Capone, you know, notorious gangster.
Right.
During the Depression, he cultivated this image of generosity, opening soup kitchens, kind of presenting himself as a man of the people.
Right.
And, you know, this really served to kind of disarm suspicion and allow him to continue his criminal activities under the radar.
It's amazing, you know, and a little scary how people can manipulate perceptions that way.
It is.
It makes you wonder, you know, even today, what's behind certain acts of generosity, for example? What's really behind it makes you think.
And, you know, speaking of thinking and being aware, you know, Greene emphasizes knowing your opponent or knowing the person you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
Right. He says that to avoid miscalculations, you need to understand their motivations, their strengths and weaknesses. He even has this kind of classification system, right?
Yeah.
The opponents, the suckers, the victims. It sounds a little harsh, but I kind of get where he's going with that. Yeah. Being able to read the people you're dealing with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, take the example of Genghis Khan. I mean, here's one of history's most brilliant military strategists.
Right. And Sultan Muhammad of the Khwarezmian Empire completely underestimated him, dismissed him and his forces, and that mistake ultimately led to the destruction of his empire.
Wow. Underestimating your opponent, huge mistake.
Yeah.
But knowing your opponent is just one part of the equation, right?
Yeah.
You also need to think about how you're going to approach your interaction strategically.
Absolutely.
Right. And in Law 13, which is when asking for help appeal to people's self-interest, Greene kind of lays out a blueprint for that. He's basically saying, instead of appealing to mercy or gratitude, you're better off framing it in a way that benefits them.
Right.
You find that win-win, right?
Exactly.
Show them how helping you is also going to help them. I think he uses an example of an art dealer.
He does, yeah. Joseph Duveen, who was a legendary art dealer, wanted to sell to this guy, Andrew Mellon, who was an American millionaire. But Mellon was very hesitant, very skeptical, but Duveen was a master of this law. He understood that Mellon wasn't just buying a painting, he was buying prestige, a legacy.
Right. He was buying a story.
Exactly. So instead of just trying to, you know, bombard him with sales pitches, Duveen took a much more subtle approach. He built a rapport with Mellon, appealed to his love of art, you know, even gave him some rare books with these beautiful reproductions of the paintings he was trying to sell.
Kind of like, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and all that.
Yeah, well, maybe in this case, it's more like, show a man how owning this painting will impress all his friends, and you've made a sale.
Yeah, exactly. That's great. So really tapping into that self-interest, that psychology. Speaking of psychology, I understand there's a really interesting example of this law in action from the story of Wu Zhao, who used this to become the first and only female emperor in Chinese history.
Oh, yeah, her story is incredible.
Wait, so she started as like a concubine?
She did. A concubine in the imperial court. Can you imagine? Starting with very little power and rising to become the emperor. I mean, that's amazing.
It's like she went from like a pawn to a queen in this huge game of chess.
Exactly. And, you know, she really was a master of understanding those levers of power, and she did it without using force or aggression. She was playing the long game, carefully cultivating relationships, understanding people's motivations, and then using that to her advantage.
So she was incredibly strategic, really understanding who to align herself with and how to position herself.
She was.
It's amazing. It makes you wonder, right, how many individuals throughout history have used these types of tactics, we'll call them, to kind of achieve their goals, even if those goals seem on the surface very, very unlikely.
Right. And I think that's what's so compelling about Greene's work, right? He's really kind of exposing these dynamics that are often at play, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
And I think that awareness, that knowledge can be really empowering, because even if we choose not to use these tactics ourselves, we can at least recognize them when they're being used on us and make more informed decisions.
It's almost like, you know, you're learning the rules of the road before you start driving.
Exactly.
Right. You don't have to speed. You don't have to run red lights.
Right.
But you need to know what those signs and signals mean if you want to navigate safely and effectively.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a really good point. It's about awareness, not necessarily endorsement. But speaking of driving, Greene also talks about the importance of timing and decisive action, right?
Right.
And that brings us to Law 47, which is, do not go past the mark you aimed for. In victory, learn when to stop.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it's kind of a mouthful. But he calls this forced time.
Yes, he does.
Right? And it's this idea that swift, decisive action can leave your opponents disoriented, unable to respond before it's too late.
Yeah.
He uses the example of Napoleon, right? Napoleon's invasion of Italy.
Yeah. Napoleon, the master strategist.
The master strategist. And he was facing pretty huge odds in that campaign.
He was. He was outnumbered, outgunned, facing these seasoned Austrian generals.
Right.
But his speed, his decisiveness, it just completely threw them off.
They weren't ready for that.
No, they weren't. They were used to this very slow, methodical style of warfare, and Napoleon just completely disrupted that.
So what can we learn from Napoleon? I mean, beyond just military tactics, right? How does this idea of forced time apply in other areas of life?
Well, I think it really highlights the importance of momentum and surprise.
Okay.
You know, Napoleon didn't give his opponents time to think, to regroup, to strategize. He kept them constantly off balance, reacting to his moves instead of the other way around. And that's a principle that can be applied in any competitive environment, whether it's business, politics, or even personal relationships.
So it's about being bold, right?
It is.
Taking those calculated risks and really not letting opportunities pass you by.
Absolutely. But, you know, as you said, Greene also cautions against getting carried away by success.
Right.
You know, knowing when to stop is just as important as knowing when to strike.
It's a delicate dance.
It is.
You have to know when to push forward and when to hold back. And this ties into the concept of formlessness, which he outlines in Law 48, right? This idea of being adaptable, of not being rigid in your thinking.
Exactly. Formlessness is all about avoiding those rigid structures, about being fluid, adaptable, able to respond to changing circumstances, you know, becoming predictable, getting stuck in your ways. That's a recipe for disaster.
And he uses the example of the Spartans for this, right?
He does. The Spartans, known for their military prowess, their discipline, but their rigid adherence to their code ultimately contributed to their downfall. They couldn't adapt to new tactics to a changing world.
So it's like that saying, be like water.
Right.
You know, water can flow around obstacles, can carve new paths, is constantly adapting to its environment.
That's a great analogy because really that's what Greene is advocating for. This kind of adaptable, fluid approach to power.
Right.
That allows you to navigate the ever-changing currents of human interaction.
So be like water, my friends.
Be like water. It's fascinating, isn't it? How certain historical figures, even centuries before Greene wrote these laws, just seem to embody them.
Yeah. It's like they had this intuitive grasp of power dynamics.
Like they were playing the game on a whole other level. We were talking about Wuxia before, right?
Yeah.
The woman who went from concubine to empress in, what was it, 7th century China?
Yeah. Talk about understanding how to play the game.
She really did. Navigating that imperial court, I mean, it was a dangerous place.
Yeah. It makes Game of Thrones look like child's play. But she managed to rise to the top.
She did. A blend of charm, intelligence, and, let's be honest, a pretty good understanding of human nature all came together for her.
She really mastered that, I think, didn't she?
Yeah.
Appealing to people's self-interest, forging alliances, even exploiting rivalries to position herself as just, well, indispensable.
And she did it all without resorting to, like, brute force or aggression.
Yeah, more like a chess grandmaster, making these subtle moves, always thinking 10 steps ahead.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial point, timing. Knowing when to act, you know, decisively.
Yeah. It's like knowing when to go all in during a poker game.
Exactly. It's about seizing the moment, disrupting things, and gaining that advantage.
And this is where Greene's concept of, forced time comes in.
Yeah, forced time. He argued that acting swiftly and decisively can totally throw your opponents off guard. They're left scrambling to react while you're already on to the next thing.
It's like in those action movies where the hero just bursts in, guns blazing, and everyone's caught completely by surprise.
Exactly. You completely disrupt their plans. Greene uses the example of Napoleon invading Italy, right?
Napoleon, the master strategist, didn't he face some pretty huge obstacles there?
He did. Outnumbered, less experienced troops, seasoned Austrian generals on the other side. But his speed and decisive victories, they just demoralized the Austrians who were used to, like, a much slower pace of war.
So it's not just about speed for the sake of speed.
Oh, no.
It's about being strategic, choosing the right moment to disrupt everything and get that upper hand.
Exactly. Understanding the flow of events,
Yeah.
even anticipating how others will react. And then you strike when you have that advantage.
But Greene doesn't advocate for just constant attack, does he?
No, he doesn't. There's a balance, right?
Right.
He talks about knowing when to stop,
Mm.
when to, be happy with what you've gained and not push things too far.
He who hesitates is lost, but also sometimes he who hesitates lives to fight another day.
You got it. That balance between boldness and restraint is key. And it's closely connected to that idea of formlessness we discussed earlier. Being adaptable, not rigid in your thinking.
Right, being like water flowing around obstacles.
Perfect analogy. Greene uses the Spartans to show what can happen when you get stuck in those rigid systems.
Yeah, the Spartans,
Yeah.
famous for their military discipline.
But they couldn't adapt. New tactics came along, the political landscape shifted, and they couldn't keep up.
So being adaptable, being willing to learn and evolve, that's crucial, no matter what game you're playing.
It is. And Greene, he emphasizes this idea of formlessness, not as abandoning your values or anything, but
Right.
recognizing that, change is the only constant. And to do well in a world that's always changing, you have to change with it.
Yeah, makes sense. Be willing to learn from what happens, take in new ideas.
Exactly. That's how you grow. That's how you stay ahead of the game.
So it's about having a mindset that's, both deliberate and fluid.
Right. You have your principles, but you're open to new ways of doing things. You're strategic, but you can adapt when things change.
I'm starting to see how all these laws connect. It's really about being thoughtful, but not stuck in your ways.
It is. And that's a skill that can serve you well no matter what you're trying to achieve. It's amazing how relevant these laws of power are even today
Yeah.
in our modern world. I mean, we've talked about emperors and generals and even gangsters, but these dynamics are still at play in our daily lives, in our workplaces, in our relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Like you said, it's not about, becoming some Machiavellian manipulator,
No.
but it is about awareness. It's about understanding of the forces that are shaping our interactions.
Exactly. And then using that awareness to make, more informed decisions.
Right. So it's like you wouldn't drive a car without understanding the rules of the road,
Yeah.
right? You got to know what the signs mean, how to handle intersections, all of that.
Right. And it's the same with these power dynamics. You need to be aware of the subtle cues, the unspoken expectations, even the hidden motivations sometimes.
Yeah. It's like that backstage pass to the human drama that we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Once you see how the sets are built, how the lights work, you see the performance in a whole new way.
Exactly. You're not just watching the show anymore. You're understanding it on a deeper level.
Right. And that awareness, that ability to see beneath the surface,
Uh-huh.
it can be incredibly empowering.
It really can.
So if you could distill all of this down to one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
I think it would be to remember this. We all have power. We all have influence, and we can all make a difference in the world around us, whether it's in our personal relationships, in our communities, or even on a larger scale.
So it's not about like some people have power and some people don't.
No, not at all. It's more about understanding the dynamics of power so we can use it effectively and ethically.
And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about shifting our focus from power over power.
Right.
It's about collaboration, about working together, about recognizing that we can achieve so much more when we combine our strengths and work towards a common goal.
I completely agree. And, it's not just about achieving goals. It's about how we achieve them.
Right.
Do we do it through manipulation and dominance? Or do we do it through collaboration, through respect? Those are the questions we need to ask ourselves.
And I think that's a really important point to end on.
Yeah.
We have the power to choose how we use our influence
We do.
and what kind of impact we want to make on the world.
Absolutely. So, to our listeners out there, keep learning, stay curious,
Yeah.
and never underestimate the power you have within you to make a positive difference.
And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into power, strategy, and deception. We'll see you next time.